All the models we built, could they have been built like 4 years ago or 5 years ago? But they would have been so expensive. LLMs have been a game changer. I think they've had both a direct impact and an indirect impact. So all these big institutions are basically bulletproof. They can do whatever they want. They can make as many mistakes as they want and they'll be fine.
Do you want every company in the world? That's your goal with this company?
That's absolutely the goal with this company. I feel like...
How do you think that's possible? Welcome to the next episode of Decoding AI. Today we are going to talk about how AI is changing decision making at the board level, at the management level. And we are talking about high stakes, low frequency decisions, as our guest here puts it. And we probably have one of the most relevant people on the planet to talk about it, because we have someone here with deep expertise in consulting from McKinsey and deep expertise in AI from Amazon. So you have this weird combination, Harsh. So I'm going to start the podcast with that. How did this happen?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think the short answer is like complete coincidence, but the longer answer is I did my engineering undergrad in India, and I was always passionate about math and I was always passionate about research. So I ended up running into a professor who was working on machine learning problems applied to mechanical engineering.
This was back in
2013.
2013 at IIT Guwahati.
At IIT Guwahati.
Okay.
And we ended up publishing a few papers, and then the papers were noticed by a professor at Georgia Tech, and they invited me to apply to the PhD program, and that's how I ended up at Georgia Tech. And about 6 months in, I ran into a director at Amazon who basically convinced me to drop the PhD and take all of my research experience to Amazon, which is basically what I ended up doing. So I went to Amazon to continue researching sequential decision making, which is basically what I was researching before, and applying it to more business problems. Started off as a one-man show reporting to an executive who had way too many things on his plate, and then eventually got to build out my own team, solve a lot of interesting problems, and then realized that I was maybe starting to specialize in Amazon's problems and not necessarily working on more generalizable issues.
Can you give an example of what was the problem?
So Amazon is unique in the sense that it plans way further ahead than pretty much any other company that I know of. So they think about what's going to happen 7 years in the future and act on it today. The crux of my research was how do you make sequential decisions such that one decision kind of impacts the next decision, but you don't really care about the outcomes of the interim decisions. You care about the outcomes of the final decision.
Interesting.
It can be brought to bear when you think really long term. So at Amazon, if you're thinking how would price perception be impacted if I price my entire portfolio a certain way, it'll probably take a couple of years to train those consumers, and that might impact the ecosystem broadly. Those are the type of questions we could answer. But to have that kind of an impact and think that long term, you have to have Amazon's scale and Amazon's resources and the charisma of Amazon's leadership. So you can get away with not focusing on short-term results, but more long-term, like big bets. That's unfortunately not the case for most people in the global economy. It ended up feeling like there was more of the world that I hadn't explored.
So you ended up joining McKinsey.
And that's exactly what happened. Absolutely. And McKinsey was incredible. I'm so grateful for the experience. I feel like McKinsey's reach is more or less unparalleled. I ended up working in Europe, Middle East, mostly in the US, all within the span of 2.5 years. Did pretty much everything from designing a strategy for a Middle Eastern airline to getting involved in a lot of software company investment decisions for some of the leading PE investors in the world. So that breadth of exposure, I can't imagine getting that anywhere else. And that also, my initial thought was maybe McKinsey will expose me to a bunch of businesses, and then I'll realize a few opportunities that I can go pursue on my own and maybe apply some of my research to those opportunities. It turns out the business I ended up learning most about was actually the business of consulting and not really the client's business, which is basically what led me to the next step.
But before we get into Bridgetown, I'd love to understand, while you were at McKinsey, What did you notice about the consulting world as a former AI scientist that you think a lot of people like us, in general, people would not have noticed?
The thing that's most shocking for tech folks is the fact that consulting firms maybe systematically underinvest in automation. Like at Amazon, if I was to own a product and I was to deliver an outcome, every year I would get approximately 12% lower budget to deliver that same outcome, because it was assumed that the productivity should grow over time because I'm going to automate stuff. At most consulting firms, the same like manager plus 2 consultant is going to do the project over and over again. The 100th time, it's going to be the exact same amount of like man hours dedicated to the project as like the first hour. Of course, some of it is explained by having to customize it for the client context, but increasingly for strategy and for commercial DD type projects, that's not really the case. But my speculation is it's a cultural thing and also a skill set composition maybe. But that was the thing that was most striking to me. There was like a whole host of other things, but that maybe was one that stood out.
And then when is it that you really started about like solving something with your own solution here?
That's a very interesting question. So actually, if I like think back to it, it probably started as soon as I got in. In the beginning, you kind of solve problems just because it's interesting to solve problems. That was my approach in the beginning as well. There were all sorts of like smaller things that I felt like I could automate. So there's like one thing that I particularly remember. There's capacity planning problem for like manufacturing companies. Regardless of what you're manufacturing, there's like basically the same problem like is faced by pretty much any manufacturer. Turns out there's like a lot of things you can automate like when you're solving this problem. So that's where I kind of started. I was able to sort of speak to a few partners about it, and they were able to coach me on like how to maximize impact with an automation like that. And then like over my 2.5 years at McKinsey, I was more directed towards like problem solving that can have more of an impact and maybe less purely driven by my interests. So I think that was a long-winded answer to your question, which was like, I think I started pretty much immediately.
Interesting.
In the beginning, it was just interesting problems.
How do you describe Bridgetown?
So Bridgetown is basically a decision research platform that's helping senior management and board make better decisions, faster decisions, more informed decisions. So that's maybe a one-line description.
Okay. Who is it for?
Senior management and the board. So effectively, I think the way we kind of think about it, Anag, is decisions are in general getting harder, like for 2 reasons. One, the average trend is new technology disruptions materialize much faster and scale much faster. So think about ChatGPT and all the things that have happened now. They scale much faster than the previous disruption. Mobile and internet took way longer. So the average case speed of doing business is much faster. 2, there is way more volatility. If you think through how much the interest rates have changed over time, how much operations had to change during COVID and right after COVID, etc. So there's way more volatility. The environment for making these decisions has gotten way more complex, but the tools to make these decisions is basically the same. So there was like a huge gap here, and it didn't seem like there was a solution that anybody was proposing or building on.
So these management level decisions, acquiring a company, moving to a new market, launching a product, what are some of these important decisions that you...
Yeah, that's absolutely it. So pivoting your product or launching a new product, like material amounts of CapEx, acquiring a company, all of these are decisions that are basically bet the farm type decisions. And I actually did not quite appreciate how important these decisions are until I got to McKinsey and I got to be in the boardroom. Like from the outside, it feels like all these big institutions are basically bulletproof. They can do whatever they want. They can make as many mistakes as they want and they'll be fine. And that was probably true to some extent like 50 years ago when the competition wasn't as intense. But now that is absolutely not the case. So I know for a healthcare services company, they borrowed a bunch of money to acquire another healthcare services company. The expectation was there's going to be all sorts of cost synergies. They can expand their services portfolio, and they borrowed against that base case. And then they basically struggled. They recently declared bankruptcy. And this was an incredible business. 50 years ago, they could have probably righted the ship But just because of the way the business is done right now and how competitive things are, these decisions have gotten way higher stake. And we're trying to help senior managers and the board make these decisions in a way more informed fashion. So help them collect data way faster, help them interpret data way better, understand the complexities at the ground level, which sometimes at larger companies you tend to disassociate with.
On the data point though, Harsh, I would assume a lot of this data is hard to access, right? Like these decisions, like we as VCs, if I have to invest $10 million in a business, I won't be going online and doing like 6 searches and get done and find the answer. There's a lot of important data which is siloed, hard to access, internal to enterprises, and sometimes this data is not even there anywhere. It's in people's heads. So we talk to a lot of experts to get that. So there's a lot of primary research, secondary research that I would assume, just like for VCs, it would go on for PE firms, consulting firms, boards of corporates, and so on. So how do you stitch that together? Do you solve this access problem too?
Absolutely. If I was to like zoom out, that's the $1 million question. If I was to zoom out, there's a question about data stock, about what do I have that I can run a search on. But increasingly, it's more about the data flow, because things are changing so quickly. Like as a VC, you probably don't want to rely on transcripts with customers that were gathered last time the company raised money, because that's fairly old. You also don't want to like rely on transcripts from even as little as 1 year ago, because things change so quickly in your world. It's very similar, and it's increasingly more similar in the private equity world and the corporate world also. So the name of the game now, I think, is data flow, which is one of the main things that we're trying to solve, which is how do we acquire fresh data cheaply and at scale so that well-informed decisions can be made. That's just one part of it, though. There's maybe 2 more things there. One is the world is getting increasingly complex as well. So interpreting that data is as much of a challenge. The world changes. You've, as an executive, haven't been necessarily as close to the front lines. You may not have the background information you need to interpret that data either. That, again, interpretation is a big problem as well. So it's not just gathering cheap data very quickly, it's also interpretation of the data. And then the third thing is, how do you reconcile data with the information you have in-house, like you mentioned? Reconciling information from documents is a non-trivial problem. Documents typically are written for a purpose. Nobody just jots down thoughts and puts that on their company SharePoint. They have an agenda. The agenda basically dictates which way the document is kind of leaning.
Yeah.
The document is going to have information from different periods of time. So you have to reconcile not only the different objectives of the document, but also the freshness of that information, which is, again, a non-trivial problem that needs to be solved to be able to make good decisions, which is, again, something that Bridgetown Research is focusing quite deeply on. Our belief is that we should start with what we call tacit knowledge, which is what do people know. We should interact with people, collect information, and then use that as a framework to interpret data pretty much from any other source, including internal or external data. So that's maybe like a preview of our solution approach.
That's interesting. In fact, that's almost exactly how people also work, right? If I look at a new startup that has come pitched to Excel, a lot of times one of the first things I would do is I would call a friend who is in that domain, working for like 10 years, get a lay of the land. And that framework then helps me go to Perplexity, do my research, look at documents, talk to more experts, figure that out. But the first few interactions is always with a trusted expert, so to say, who can help think through the framework which is needed to understand this new space.
And that is exactly what we're trying to quote unquote industrialize. So effectively, what I'm trying to do is encode this expertise that your friend provided in your case, and then distribute it as widely as I can. We have our own mechanisms to sort of codify it. We rely on industry executives and deeper research, a bunch of consultants who have been in the space for a while. We encode it in a way that it can be reapplied to new sets of information to infer decision-specific data as needed. So that is, I couldn't have described what we're trying to do better. That's exactly what we're trying to do. Like your process, we're just trying to make sure we can scale it to pretty much every company on the planet.
So now everyone has like infinite friends in whatever space they want and get started on research.
Absolutely.
Okay.
One, like they have infinite friends. Two, they don't have to spend time talking to all of those friends necessarily.
Yeah.
They can basically have.
The other interesting aspect, the first time you pitched to us, was it's not just a one-way efficiency. It's not that just I am saving time of collecting this data. The person who is the expert, who wants to share all of this data, even they are having a much better life, spending much lesser time talking to us now. How is that happening?
That is like actually absolutely right. So if I was to get into the nitty-gritties, the platform basically has three main sets of features.
Yeah.
Feature set one is analysis planning.
Yeah.
So effectively, I provide a high-level question to the software. It breaks it down into smaller questions. It asks itself, do I have enough data to answer these questions? If not, what am I missing and where can I get it from? I can get it from secondary sources, so the internet or a reliable third-party research firm, or I can go talk to a quote-unquote friend. And then the second piece of software then executes a lot of these. Specifically, it can automatically go recruit a friend. It can chat with the friend, bring back a bunch of information. And then the third piece of software basically ties all of this together and serves it up in an easy to interact with fashion so that you can build on top of what we've produced for you. So the second bit that I was talking about, that's what's driving most of the efficiency.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, we aren't necessarily driving the efficiency all by ourselves.
Yes.
The one thing that I take a lot of pride in is the fact that we've been able to collaborate and be a good citizen of this ecosystem. So the main players that kind of contribute so that you can make that decision is one, expert networks. These are companies that find a friend for people who are friendless in the space and then like they bring them to you.
Yeah.
Then there's consulting firms that kind of curate this data.
Correct.
So you've some friends may not know. You don't want to like read through 10,000 transcripts and like reconcile pieces of information. Then consulting firms like play a big part.
And of course, they bring in domain expertise.
And then all sorts of other people. So the management teams of a company bring in the talent perspective. There are PE funds and banks and lenders that bring in the capital. So all of these people sort of come together to solve that kind of problem. So we've basically worked with a lot of them, some leading players who were like extremely progressive that could see the trend and were betting ahead.
Yeah.
We've partnered with them so for example, we can interact with an expert network using APIs. We can automatically leverage them to recruit folks, and then we can bring back a bunch of information by having a conversation with the folks that they have recruited. This works out extremely well for the expert networks because they're getting incremental volume.
Yeah.
It works extremely well for the experts because now they have more steady engagement because just the volume of work has kind of increased. There's also all sorts of flexibility, so they don't have to pre-schedule a phone call. They can just hop on a phone with an AI and like have a conversation.
I think that's an important point, this one. It's one of the key unlocks I feel which AI has done. Not just for Bridgetown, even for other applications of AI. The advantage of having an AI agent of sorts on both sides is that you take away synchronization. Right. Now, if two people have to talk to each other, exchange information, my AI agent can talk to your AI agent or you, or like basically you can have 4C2 combinations here.
Yeah.
And you don't really need both the calendars to be synced.
Right.
If I want any information from you, I can just send what I want. You could be driving to the airport and just easily speak to your phone and get that.
Right.
Versus scheduling would have been, of course, a hassle. And imagine consulting firms doing it like with 20, 30, 50 folks. So that thing really stood out to us when you first pitched the idea. It's almost changing the laws of physics of conversation here because you don't need sync anymore.
Yeah, one, you don't need sync anymore. Two, I think people underappreciate the fact that there is some skill to being an interviewee. I'm appreciating it even more right now, but not everyone is as good at anticipating like what the other person needs and providing the exact right answer.
Correct.
that's another thing that having AI on the other side kind of resolves.
Yeah.
Because the AI can be way more patient and be more specific in terms of extracting information. And then it can serve up information and it can be as skilled as like the more skilled interviewee to provide that information to you. So there's like the coordination problem that is definitely being solved. There's also a skill problem that we've noticed in our work that is like majorly making a difference. Our ingoing hypothesis was that each interview is like probably going to be worse because the interviewer isn't as sophisticated as potentially an investor, etc. But it turned out that it's also being offset by the fact that there is a skill gap that this AI is filling.
I think that's the most counterintuitive thing, at least I have learned about Bridgetown since investing, is it's not like when, honestly, when we did the pre-seed investment, our hypothesis was that Bridgetown Research will give faster research. And you'll have to do a lot of it to be higher quality, then you'll need to have a human in the loop. But in a few months, you kind of prove that it's not just faster, it's actually better research. I think that's been a standout, I would say, the last few months.
Yeah, and I think those are like more or less correlated, maybe not with speed, but with scale. I feel like mediocre analysis of a high volume of data produces vastly superior outcomes than exceptional analysis of like a small amount of data or publicly available data. Which is the switch that I don't think we ourselves anticipated how big of a difference that could be. But now we can understand markets in so much more granularity. We can segment it with 100x times the resolution that we could have done it if I was manually calling a bunch of people up like I used to do at McKinsey, which has been a game changer for us. That kind of means that we can also generalize more easily because we understand things at a more fundamental level. It does still require like an upfront investment of human effort. But then once you've plonked that in, like there's more to get out of it.
It almost doesn't seem like an automation problem at all. This is actually getting better at what you do.
Exactly, and that's one thing that I've been trying to explain to some of the people that we're trying to work with, that this is more for a paradigmatic change. So before, the way we used to kind of do the work was, we've got, let's say I've signed the LOI, I've got 3 weeks before I can make the investment. I'm going to prioritize the 20% of the analyses that I think like reveal the value. And then I'll prioritize that. Now what I can do is I can basically, what McKinsey speak is boil the ocean. I can do pretty much every analysis under the sun. And then I can walk through all these analyses to see like which drove my answer forward, which is incredible. It ends up giving you an incremental benefit from what you would have uncovered if you were more selective in investigating some areas versus others. So the shift from let's prioritize and do 20% of the work way better to let's do everything and then prioritize which we want to double down on. That is actually more meaningful than it's obvious.
There was like no fundamental reason other than, I guess, time and resource constraint to do less work, right? To make these important decisions.
Exactly. I feel like, and I was listening to this conversation between, I think it was the CEO of Hippocratic AI and Hemant Taneja, and they were describing the healthcare problem. And they were effectively saying the entire healthcare system is kind of designed assuming there is a deficit of healthcare providers. And a lot of things they said kind of made me realize that a lot of what consulting firms do is basically healthcare for companies. And the entire system is designed assuming there is a deficit of these seasoned experts who have seen these low frequency decisions enough number of times to be able to help. And there were so many parallels. I feel like the more I think about it, the more I'm like bought into this analogy, because even companies kind of have a natural lifespan. It used to be 60 years, maybe I think 50 years ago or something. Now an average S&P 500 company sort of lasts 20 years. So there is a finite lifespan. There is some notion of a company health that can be either maintained preemptively or you can jump in and have corrective measures. I think that's a very rich analogy, but I'm like maybe patting myself on the back too much. I'll stop.
Let's move to technology, Harsh. Do you think this company was possible 2 years back? What's the role of LLMs?
First of all, LLMs have been a game changer. I think they've had both a direct impact and an indirect impact. So in my mind, there were like two main problems to solve. One was the cooperation problem, which I was mentioning. There's a lot of stakeholders, to basically beat this analogy to death, to like do healthcare for all these companies. And then second was like there was a lot of technical things that need to be solved. So I'll touch on like why LLMs help with both of those. So with the stakeholders, I think typically large companies don't make big bets very easily. But now the revolution is almost so salient that people are willing to make that bet.
Yeah.
The biggest, fastest growing expert network, we were able to partner with them because the founder sort of understood the impact of the technology. Two of the leading consulting firms engaged with us and work with us now because this was so salient to them. I feel like that kind of momentum would have been impossible to generate if the impact of LLMs wasn't that obvious. So that's, I think, the business impact. And then technically, I think if you ask me, have all the models we built, could they have been built like 4 years ago or 5 years ago? I'd probably say that they could have been built 5 years ago, but they would have been so expensive to build because the way to build these models was basically generating a bunch of data, curating it, annotating it. All of that was really expensive.
Yeah.
So like the hundreds of models we built would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And then you would need like an extreme amount of conviction to give us that kind of money to go do that.
Definitely different from our first round.
Exactly. Yeah. So like that free seed couldn't have built those models. But thankfully, Sam Altman was able to convince the world to like spend that money up front and then unlocked all these paths for us that were unimaginable before. So now we can actually generate quite a bit of synthetic data and then be more targeted in curating it and then create these smart models that get the job done for us. The second big thing that we are only starting to appreciate now is how simple and intuitive a text-based interface is. So interacting with these hundreds of smaller models when you had to play around with the hyperparameters would have been like really complicated. And I can't imagine like a bunch of consultants being trained to interact with these models independently. But now LLMs as a UI UX layer has been just a massive unlock. So I think we can push the problem way further, make the technology way more accessible because of LLMs also.
You talked about these small models. So are these fine-tuned small models? Because the moment we talk about domain-specific applications of AI, question of fine-tuning, how much fine-tuning, is it an overkill? All those things always come up. What's your experience been like with fine-tuning? Have you really needed to fine-tune a lot for many of your use cases? How do you make those decisions?
Yeah, so in our world, when I talk about small models, maybe I could be talking about everything from just those traditional like regression models to like random forests to transformer-based models. So we've got a portfolio of things that are more or less customized to do exactly one specific task. So actually, let me back up and explain like how the thing works. Effectively, we've got this large language model. Usually, we rely on frontier models from OpenAI or Anthropic to build out an analysis plan. We give them a bunch of examples. We tell them this is what the plan needs to look like. And then they give us the plan back. And then we kind of execute this plan using small customized models that can do only that specific task. So for the most part, we have both fine-tuned like transformers as well as build our own like traditional, I'll call them now, small models. But my learning has been that it's only useful to build a model if like these large language models aren't giving you the performance you need. To me, cost and latency is probably not a good argument to build your own models because these things have been getting so cheap so quickly and
so much faster than the Moore's law.
Exactly. So everything that we have built from scratch or fine-tuned
Yeah.
has been solely for the purpose of better performance or more reliability.
Yeah.
Because we work in like a very narrow domain,
Yeah.
I think in machine learning there is like a concept of bias variance trade-off,
Yeah.
which is effectively how do you minimize the error over your training set
Yeah.
when you're training new models. And when the models are trained for like a broader domain, then it is possible that there's a lot of bias when you're looking at any small like part of that training set. Now, like large language models were trained on the entire data of the universe, and we are only interested in like the small part of the universe. So there are occasions where the bias is like very substantial, and
Sure.
there's a lot of performance gains to be had.
Yes.
To us, like the three main areas where we've like materially extracted way more performance is maybe training our own embeddings for solving the search problems or like a flavor of search problems. I think a lot of classification models, we end up getting way better performance
By fine-tuning?
By fine-tuning
Okay,
in our
okay.
own domains from a way smaller model.
Makes sense. Because classifications could be different from domain to domain. Okay.
Exactly.
Makes
Exactly.
sense. Yeah.
So, and then we are starting to experiment with extracting structured data. Initial indications are that there might be some value to be extracted there as well. We had assumed that OpenAI would be basically the best, and it was like amazing so far. But now that we're sort of tinkering with our own structured extraction models, we've kind of realized that maybe there is something to be had there. But for pretty much everything else, like I think frontier models like are amazing. If you're working in a business that can kind of afford that, like our business sort of supports that kind of like spend.
What about the latest releases and developments? The OpenAI is leading quite a bit of that also about reasoning by models, like O1, O3. Do you see application of that yourself? What do you think is the implication?
Absolutely. So I can tell you about our business. So like I was mentioning, one thing our software does is first plan out the analysis. So we don't just want like retrieve a bunch of data and throw it at the user or like summarize it. We do a bunch of analyses to produce like high quality answers to those like critical questions. To build those high quality answers, there's a planning stage where we basically say that, hey, here are 4 ways in which we can answer the question. Let me do A, B, and C in like method number 1. Let me do like X, Y, Z in like method number 2, and so forth. That sort of planning, I feel like reasoning models are just incredible at. We've tried to beat the performance of a reasoning model, even in an extremely small domain, and we failed. But O1 type models like just do so much better at that stuff. So I think the way we see it is as these reasoning models get better and better, we'll continue to rely on them to do the planning, and the agents that we're building would just get more and more reliable.
Makes sense.
I think the threshold for reliability isn't even that high to drive material impact. So even if the agents were 50% reliable, the impact is incredible. But like when these agents get like 90% reliable, that's another level of autonomy. Like right now, I can't trust an agent to go like spend $20,000 interviewing a bunch of people and then running that analysis. If $20,000 is my budget, I would probably be more deliberate and have more human touch points.
Yeah.
And that's partly because the reasoning models aren't that reliable. The plans aren't that robust. I would imagine these agents being more and more reliable and more independent. So I think the big unlock is, like I was mentioning, these agents, they first plan out the analyses before they execute it. As these reasoning models get more and more advanced, these plans can get more and more complex, and these plans can get more and more expensive as well. So right now, for example, I wouldn't trust an agent to go spend $20,000 to research a question. Just because they're just not as reliable yet. Once, hopefully with O3, these plans are extremely reliable. I can now have plans that are hundreds of steps that spend $50,000, $100,000 and come back to me with a way higher quality answer, which would hopefully make a scale even more broadly and even more quickly across business problems.
I think, Harsh, sorry to interrupt you, but even today, then that's where probably your delivery team comes into the picture, right? To your end client, does this unreliability like get exposed, or how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's maybe like the an unconventional choice that I was most nervous about. So instead of going in and basically pitching a piece of software to most of our clients, what we said that here's a bunch of human beings
Yeah.
that will fix the software.
And these are exceptional human beings, by the way. I'm just plugging it in.
Yeah, these are like exceptional human beings.
Yeah.
A lot of them are my former colleagues from McKinsey, and some of them are from Bain. So they've basically seen this rodeo before.
Yeah.
So they are basically willing to jump in and absorb the risk of these agents faltering.
Yes.
So if the budget of the research is $50,000, we won't just let the agent run like willy-nilly and interview whoever.
Yes.
Every time it spends $5,000 or gets up to $5,000, someone steps in and says like, hey, is this trending in the right direction?
Yeah.
Are we refining the hypotheses the right way?
Yeah.
Are we interviewing the right people? And all of that is being done by people who have seen what amazing looks like. So we've 100% absorbed the risk of agentic misbehavior.
So your customers don't need to wait for AI to get to that point, right?
Exactly.
It's more of an internal change for Bridgetown then.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've absorbed 100% of the risk that comes along with new technology by also building
having
this team
human
of,
in the loop.
Yeah, exactly.
Sense. Yeah.
Exactly. And but as we like scale, we're like obviously really counting on O3 to come through for us.
Yeah. Absolutely. Great. So I would urge you to take your scientist hat off. I know we can go on for days on this. Coming back to your early business and go to market, I think very early on you were able to partner with super credible networks and firms in this business, right? For forming some strategic partnerships. How important has that been to your early success?
I think that has kind of been critical. So the main thing about operating in a narrow domain is you kind of need enough data to basically build out your models. Sounds like I didn't take my scientist hat off. I'll take it off now. But that's kind of been critical. So two things needed to happen. One is we need to accumulate this data, which we've relied on our partnerships with expert networks to kind of solve. The second is, I think for the most part, everyone who is looking at like AI in general is super focused on, can I take cost out of my like business?
Yeah.
There are very few people who are kind of innovating on how can I deliver an exceptional client experience. Closely partnering with a consulting firm who kind of had that sort of a perspective that they were willing to innovate on their service offering. They were saying that we've always done this, but let's also try this because it creates value for the client. That was also necessary to basically do what effectively we are doing. So we've been able to get access to way more funds through our consulting partners, and we've been able to scale our data acquisition way faster thanks to our expert network partners.
Yes.
And we're all fairly committed to like seeing a positive change coming
because
out
the
in this
business
industry.
model seems like a win-win for everybody in this.
Absolutely. So if you think about expert networks, typically when you must have used expert networks, you probably talk to the decision makers or executives. The way we kind of approach the problem is we're trying to talk to the frontline and the mid-tenure professionals who are closer to the business. Because we can scale it indefinitely, we can still get a full picture of the business, but at the same time, we can also benefit from the granularity that comes from speaking to someone who's closer to the operations.
Yeah.
All of this is net new business for expert networks. So they have benefited. Again, with consulting firms, for consulting firms that were necessarily only focused on how do I drive costs out, maybe this wouldn't have been as compelling of an offering, but for consulting firms that are asking themselves, how do I add way more value to my clients? This has been a game changer. So maybe not to beat that point to death, but just for context, like what leading firms kind of do, like including McKinsey and Bain, is they make sure that if they're charging like X amount of fees, they're adding 10X amount of value. Now, like there's a finite number of problems that you can kind of solve that has that sort of a return. If you're charging $1 million for a project. But now if you can create all of these offerings which are light touch and like you can charge only 100, 150K in fees, there's so many more problems that can add $1 million of value to the business. So the amount of impact can be very materially accelerated. You can unlock all these pockets of value, which like you couldn't address because the economics didn't work out. But now the economics does work out. So the scale of impact that consulting firms can have, the depth of partnership they can have with their clients is very substantial. And the same story plays out for private equity funds also. Tell me if that's interesting. But
of course, yeah. I love private equity and the role it plays in society. I would love to know more about that.
Yeah. So for the longest term, a lot of the excess returns in private equity was kind of driven by mostly financial engineering and a lot of buying at low prices because the capital market wasn't as efficient. There was a small amount of capital chasing a large amount of deals. So just the demand supply led to amazing returns.
I think that's how Warren Buffett and like a lot of those vintage investors started.
Yeah. I don't mean to hate on like those kids, but I'm sure like they added some amount of value also. But
of course, but like there was a low-hanging opportunity for a long time.
It's very different now. Most of these excess returns are mostly driven by operational improvements. Now, driving operational improvements, again, like you can either 80-20 it like you used to, which is here's maybe 3 or 4 things that I've done at all my other portfolio companies and I think I can do it here, and then you price the deal accordingly and so forth. Or you can be more exhaustive in your analyses even before you buy the company. And you can find all of these other not so low-hanging fruits because now you have a ladder and you can maybe price the deal a bit higher to increase your win rates, and then you can execute more reliably to deliver excess returns.
Yeah.
All of that is, I think, making material changes to this industry as well. And like we are hoping to be a part of that trend. Better healthcare for more companies. To go back to that analogy, I'm obsessed with it now.
No, that's an interesting analogy. So, talking about your early adoption, one thing relatively unique about Bridgetown Research is that you have kind of started at the top of the market. When we invest in software companies, most of these companies will start with some design partners, and it will be a while before they prove it out with mid-market or SMBs. They will start getting enterprises. In very few instances do you actually start top down. And even if you do, it takes a year, 2 years to maybe land your first real production customer. But you have kind of flipped this problem and you have started at the absolute cream layer of this industry. Some of the household names in consulting and PE are your customers. Do you have any advice for other AI founders? Like, how do you build trust as a young company in your first 6 to 9 months if they also wanted to try this out?
Yeah, I think we may be in like a great position. I don't know if I can take much credit for it, but I think there were 2 choices we deliberately made. And I wouldn't like say that starting at the top is necessarily better than starting at the bottom. I think either could work. Like we made a strategic choice to start at the top because there were 2 things that we wanted to do. One, we wanted to solve the hardest problem there is, and then like all the simpler problems would then be easier to solve. And we felt like it'll be easier to start with the hard problem and then go down. If it doesn't work out, then we'll know up front. Because we didn't see a lot of folks doing it. And if we were going to fail, we wanted to fail fast. So that was like a deliberate choice to start at the top. And then the second thing is, I think the large clients are generally more risk averse.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you need to build a lot of trust as like a new startup. So,
which is why we ended up having a bunch of extremely qualified humans in the loop who could basically de-risk this thing entirely.
I see.
So, like any downside we absorb, and we bring to them the same quality of service that McKinsey or Bain would bring to them.
Got it.
Which is like, we will do whatever it takes to like not fail. So I think that has kind of been the big.
So you leverage the brand and the credibility of the people that are involved here.
Exactly. Exactly. Plus like we do have like some capital, as you might know, to absorb financial risk also.
Yeah.
So if like the research doesn't pan out, it's not like we're going and asking them to pay for it anyway.
Yeah.
We make sure the project doesn't fail.
Yes.
And if it fails, then we absorb the risk. So that's been
that
like
gives them the comfort to try.
Exactly.
So basically, it's a no-cost trial.
It definitely costs something, but it's no cost if it fails.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it doesn't fail.
Fair.
Or it hasn't failed so far.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
You mentioned this, I think almost the first time or the second time that we met, that you want every company in the world, literally every business from the local coffee shop to an Amazon, to use Bridgetown or at least consider using Bridgetown. That's your goal with this company.
That's absolutely the goal with this company. I feel like.
How do you think that's possible? Why will that happen?
I mean, I just go back and hopefully we can remove this analogy when we edit this. But I just go back to the healthcare analogy. Just saying that big businesses should have access to healthcare, but not small businesses, just feels like morally not right. Just based on the moral principles of it, we are looking to build something that is broadly accessible. Two, I think we have done all.
We are definitely not going to edit this.
Yeah, we are also like tweaking everything so that it is broadly accessible. So the cost of accessing data is 100x cheaper. The cost of interpreting that data is 100x cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
We have driven down cost to a point where, regardless of the value that this project is going to add, for all practical purposes, you can afford to spend like the money on this project. So earlier, you needed the project to like maybe add $10 million of value for all of this work to be economically feasible.
Yeah.
We have gotten to a point where all of this sophisticated decision research can be done for like 100x cheaper. So we can enable projects that are 100x smaller in impact, which like by default includes pretty much every company like that's making these decisions. So that's kind of our aspiration.
Universal access to healthcare for companies.
Exactly. I feel like I've finally sold you on the analogy. I'm glad.
We end every podcast with founders here with a little bit about your hiring strategy. And if for the listeners of this podcast, if anyone is keen to apply to Bridgetown, what kind of roles you're hiring for and what do you look for?
Right. So we are hiring for pretty much every role. So we are hiring product managers, science folks, and engineers. Our hiring approach is maybe slightly different than maybe what you've probably experienced at bigger companies. We tailor the role to the individual rather than like designing a role and then looking for individuals who fit the role. We are just looking for the best talent that we can find. That's one of the core principles. When you come meet us, you'll notice that everyone sort of is doing a mixture of things. So people wear a product management hat on for 30% of their time at Bridgetown, and then 70% they could be engineering or consultant or whatever else. That's because we're like designing roles to people. So if you feel like you resonate with the problem we're solving and there's something that you could contribute, we would absolutely love to chat. And then I wouldn't necessarily think of it as like which box can you fit in or like which boxes can you check. If you're exceptional at something and you feel like that thing can help advance the mission that we're on, please come chat with us.
Okay, great. Thanks, Harsh, for taking the time. This was a unique conversation because mostly as I started the podcast, we have mostly been talking about daily lives of AI application users. But there are these important decisions which happen once or few times a year. And there also AI has a very important role. And as we can envision the future of universal access to decision making, I think Bridgetown has a good role to play there. All the best with that journey.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It was amazing.